Hello, everyone. This is Greg Scorzo, and you're listening to the Coda Publishing Podcast, number 10. Today is part 2 of my conversation with evolutionary psychology grad student and op-ed writer William Costello. In this conversation, we'll be talking about incels, or the involuntarily celibate, as they call themselves. We'll be discussing William's views regarding our social misconception of what an incel is, the relationship between sexuality and justice, Incel as a victim identity, the problem of women not being attracted to larger and larger amounts of men, socially normalized sexism against men, male entitlement to the female body, whether one can change one's sexuality, evolutionary mismatches in mating, the relationship between money and female arousal, problems with dating apps, the relationship between porn and the incel, and how psychologically normal your average incel actually is. Now, what's fascinating is you've written a quite controversial piece called, it's difficult for me to even say this without cracking up, Step Your Dick Up, Why Incels Deserve Better Advice. Now, the reason why this is fascinating is because what you actually say in this piece, I don't think is that controversial relative to most of the moral intuitions most people have. But it performs things you're not supposed to perform in today's culture wars.
Yeah, it's certainly a hard group to write about sympathetically. And, the response to the article has been largely positive, thankfully, amongst incels themselves, amongst normies, and even amongst some feminists. So I don't know whether that's a sign that I've done something really good or maybe something not so good if it's pleasing everyone. But I was worried walking a tightrope writing the article, but hopefully people enjoy it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I certainly enjoyed it. I'm first off curious, what inspired you to write this piece? How did you get involved in the plight of the incels? Because you don't seem like you're in anywhere near their vicinity when it comes to being able to pick up women.
Well, thanks, Greg. How I got involved in it and why it became kind of important to me is I believe you had Elizabeth Hobson on your podcast before.
Yes.
So she invited me to a men's rights event called Messages for Men in London. And there was a range of interesting speakers talking about various men's issues, a really good event. And one of them that really resonated with me was a self-defined incel called Richard. And, he overcame obvious crippling anxiety to stand in front of us all at the conference, at the event, and speak about insights about what it's like to be an incel and how demeaning he finds most of the advice that gets given to him. And I detail some of this advice in my article. The 3 points I fixate on is he gets frustrated when people tell him to just be himself and to just lift, bro, which means... apparently people within the men's rights manosphere tell him that just by lifting weights and building himself up that way, that'll solve all of his romantic problems. And that's very insufficient when you consider the amount of incels that report to have mental or physical disabilities to overcome. And it's also just quite demeaning to the problem anyway to suggest that you could just fix all your problems by lifting weights. So just be yourself. Just lift weights. And what was the last one? The last piece of advice is there's somebody out there for everyone. So all of this kind of advice, in my opinion, it sounded like a lot of gaslighting. So it's like gaslighting an incel into thinking, well, actually, all this stuff you're complaining about, it isn't really a problem. Or if it is a problem, the problem is you're not being your authentic self. And it just struck me that I think people are uncomfortable acknowledging that there's a lot of men out there who are just by every metric that might be appealing to women sexually or romantically, that there are a lot of men that just aren't successful in those domains, and that a lot of that is immutable. And I use the example of height in my essay, and I can't remember the statistics I quote. Maybe you have them, Greg. But height is a big deal breaker for many women. And now sometimes an incel might be able to overcompensate for their lack of physical attractiveness or lack of height, for example. But, there's almost the expectation. It's not easy to compensate for something with the expectation is, oh, well, I know lots of unattractive men who have attractive girlfriends or who've no problem with women. But, they are the exceptions of the rule, and they have to compensate. And it's not easy to just conjure up an amazing personality to compensate for your lack of physical attractiveness. And also, there's a lot of studies and research out there that shows people consider someone who's attractive looking to have a better personality in the first place. I think it was George Carlin or some comedian. He made a joke about how women say that they really like funny men, that's the type of man they like. But in his experience, the type of funny men that they mean are men like Brad Pitt, George Clooney, and Bruce Willis, or someone like this. Mm-hmm. So, I was struck when I heard Richard talking. It sounded like we demean the problems he faces and represents in society. And up until that point, I hadn't thought in any sophisticated way about incels. And it was just, the term was almost a comical, it existed as an insult. And it's now, that's kind of how it's used online. People aren't really keen to figure out the social phenomenon that's causing young men to not have access to sexual relationships. And they just use the term as an insult for any kind of low status man. No.
Well, they get upset even if you use phrases like what you've just said. You said men have access. Even that phrase upsets people.
Yeah, that's right. So with incels, there's two things we do that's unusual that we don't typically do. Typically, we rail against the idea of taking the worst examples of a specific group and using that as an exemplar of that group. For example, with Muslims as terrorists, we know that it's wrong to judge all Muslims by the worst within that group. However, we're very keen to do that with incels. There's been a few very tragic, high-profile cases of incels who've lashed out at society and in violent kind of rage and even killed people. There's a few very famous cases. Within another group of incels, then you've got another kind of circular group that spends a lot of time online. A significant minority of incels spend their time online kind of espousing misogynistic vitriol online, or shit posting, as they would call it. And then, perhaps the majority of incels are just men who are struggling. So the second thing that we typically do in society that we don't do with incels is that typically when a group is very disenfranchised, we tend to try to prop them up if possible. And if that's not possible, we at least have sympathy for the way in which they're disenfranchised.
Right.
However, we don't do that at all with incels. I've had the most kind-hearted, extreme left-wing, equality-seeking people turn into Ayn Rand philosopher, individual objectivists in response to incels. It's an amazing shift. People are just kind of like, well, no one helped me, and nobody is entitled, and there's no kind of empathy towards the plight of what this might feel like. And that's, I tried to dig at that a little bit in my article with thought experiments like the veil of ignorance, to get people to imagine how easily it could be them, or what would they like the world to be like.
So tell us a bit more in detail, since the listeners don't have this article in front of their face. What was this veil of ignorance thought experiment you did?
So the veil of ignorance thought experiment is the idea that you imagine you're kind of taken away from the person you are now, and you're put behind a veil. And on the other side of this veil exists the world. And you don't know what that world is going to look like and what your position will be within that world. And it's from that vantage point that people are asked to ethically design what world they might think is just, when they don't know what place they will personally hold in it. So I applied this to thinking about inceldom, and tried to encourage people to imagine that, what kind of world would you want if you didn't know which place you would hold in it? What would you like someone who has the struggles that many incels report to have? How would you like them to be treated, or what kind of options would you like in front of them?
Okay, so what's interesting about this thought experiment, I don't know if you know this, but this is actually a variation of what's in John Rawls's book, A Theory of Justice.
Yes, that's right. I think I linked to Rawls in the article somewhere.
And one of the reasons why people would find it very controversial for you to use this in the context of incels is because when Rawls uses it, he's talking about justice, that is, what are you owed by society. But the reason why that makes people bristle is people think, well, justice and sexuality are so different because no one is owed any sexuality. As soon as you bring the concept of owe into sex, you're on a slippery slope into rape. What do you think about that?
This is the common kind of retort that's thrown at incels or anyone who speaks sympathetically about incels is, well, nobody is owed sex or nobody is entitled to sex, right? And I've never really met or talked with any incel who really believes that they're entitled to be given sex as a right. But in an abstract way, don't we all feel like we should be entitled to some of the most rich relationships that people have? The sexual and romantic relationships are some of the most meaningful and rich relationships people have in life. And, we shouldn't look at people who don't have access to that or can't build those for themselves. We shouldn't look at them with scorn. We should actually try and help them, in my opinion, or at least have sympathy for them. It's unusual, and I see a little bit of a gender imbalance here, whereby it's particularly men who are excluded from sexual life that don't get any sympathy. I use in the example of female incels or femcels, which many incels would claim don't truly exist in the same way, because they'll often have options, sexual options, no matter how unattractive they might be. That there's a bit of an imbalance, but female incels are kind of almost celebrated in the media. Emma Watson, very much celebrated as self-partnered.
Is she a female? Is she a female incel, or is she just somebody not in a relationship yet?
That's right. That's kind of the difference between her and most women and male incels, is that she might have trouble finding the sex and love that she really wants, but she could always find sex or love or relationship compared to incels. So the way I describe it in the article is that many women have tough choices, but many men, the incels, have no choices. So it's a different kind of issue.
Okay, so this kind of leads to an important point, which you stress in the article. How do you define an incel?
Yeah, so that's interesting and something I'm hoping to work on in my dissertation, actually, because I don't think definitions that use a time metric of 6 months without sex or 1 year without sex, I don't think they're sufficient to define an incel. And also, there's a difference between incel and a dry spell. So I'm working on something in my dissertation called the level of inceldom scale that will actually, it's kind of like almost like a worldview or an ideological position or feeling about the world, and a scale that you can kind of measure where you fall on that. And I'm hoping to develop that and hopefully it catches on. I'm working with actually some incels have given their opinions on it, and they think, yes, this actually describes what it means to be an incel. So watch out for that when it comes. But it's basically, the way I describe it is, I think identity is a big important part to it, because there's a big difference in character between somebody who just isn't getting sex, and then someone who lives their life defining themselves as an incel. And this is where the identity element and it being a kind of a seductive identity is very important, because it's a kind of a fatalistic trapping whereby if you identify as an incel and kind of see the world, you define your identity around this perceived inability to get sex or romantic options, then and if that identity is actually a positive for you compared to the dating market. So I make the point in my article, how can we blame incels for retreating into this incel victim identity compared to participating in the mating market? By choosing the incel identity, they get a sense of fraternity with other men. They get a common grievance that they can complain about online a lot. They get a rich lexicon of kind of funny terminology and words that they can experiment and play around with. They get the common enemy of sexual selection, women, and sexually successful men. And they don't have to participate anymore in an anxiety-inducing, expensive, exhausting mating market that was giving them no success. So why do we want them to participate in something that's causing them so much pain in any case? It's like we want men, or the kind of low status, low attractiveness men, to keep trying and failing, and don't complain about it. So it's like, on one level, I can understand that, and I would always encourage incels to try and participate and improve their chances and not to give up, because I believe sexual and romantic relationships are some of the most meaningful and rich available to humans. But I totally understand that there may come a point for many incels where they just get fed up of trying, and they say, it's not actually helping my life in any way to keep trying to achieve success here. I'm out. Sorry, it's causing me too much pain. Why should we insist that they keep trying? And I make the point in the article about the expensive part. With such an expectation on men to pay for relationships and dates, and we talk about antiquated gender roles. There's not that much complaining about men having to pay on first dates, which is pretty much a standard norm by which we all live, even in the West. That racks up, and that gets it's not nothing. And so, yeah, I can understand how an incel would trade the participation in this gauntlet of a dating market for the kind of identity and victim identity and fraternity of the incelosphere.
What would you say to somebody who says, well, the incel is just kind of a variation of a sort of person who finds different aspects of relationships with others difficult and unsatisfying no matter how hard they try? So just like there's an incel who can't get laid, there's also another type of person who, no matter how many relationships they get in, they're never satisfied with them. They find them painful, so they give up on relationships. Is the incel just like a different variation of the person who gives up on relationships because they find them too painful and they have too many breakups or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, I think so personally, and an incel will probably bristle at me saying that, because they'll say, no, the difference is we cannot gain access. But that's objectively impossible to prove, right? So there must be something different in character. It must be a worldview, a kind of fatalistic, within incel discourse, they would describe this as the black pill, taking the black pill, which means accepting that there's nothing that they can do to improve their romantic prospects. That's a kind of a phrase within their discourse. It's called the black pill philosophy. So yeah, in my view, it's objectively impossible to prove someone can't gain access to sex, love, or relationships. So in that sense, it is similar to what you described. It is to some extent like giving up, because it's objectively impossible to prove that someone can't.
Do you think it's similar to a person who commits suicide because they think no matter how many times I've tried to be happy in life, I just can't do it and I get hurt, so I'm going to check out?
Yeah, I mean, that's a bit extreme, but yeah, you can liken it to that, where they say this participating in the process is too painful and not yielding any good results for me. My only option here is to not participate.
Now, what's fascinating is when people are suicidal, society is quite keen to say, let's come up with strategies to help them get out of that, because when they commit suicide, it really hurts everybody else.
Mm.
When people are unhappy with relationships and they don't want to get in them anymore, people are like, well, that's your choice. Maybe the problem is with you. But with incels, it seems like there's a much more extreme reaction from society, and that is contempt.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think there's contempt for this group of people, given how similar they are to the other two groups that don't seem to engender that much contempt from society?
I think it's kind of, we don't like it, our kind of, it's almost our scorn for incels is a kind of an acknowledgement at how shallow and superficial sexual selection can be at times, or what we base sexual attraction around. It's kind of like we'd rather pretend that all of this is just because incels are bad people, have terrible personalities, and they deserve it. And that's something I want to measure in my dissertation, actually, is societal attitudes towards incels as well, to see what they kind of think of them and why. It also kind of, it's just, it's an acknowledgement at how unfair and arbitrary sexual selection can be.
Do you think another component which might explain this contemporary hatred for incels is the fact that since 2014 we've had a very feministy pop culture, not just politics, where it's often described that we live in a patriarchy, that all men sort of deserve a bullocking for benefiting from or not challenging hard enough. And so there's an assumption in popular culture that if there's a group of men who want to have sex with women and the women don't want them back, these men must be in some way connected to this patriarchy, which tells all men that they're entitled to women, that women are disposable objects, that they should be subservient, and so on. And that's why this group is getting so much scorn heaped upon it right now. What would you say to that?
Yeah, I think that gets to the root of it as well. And it kind of, the only power in this patriarchy narrative is economic or political power. That's the only type of power that's acknowledged. Erotic capital or sexual power or attractiveness is never acknowledged as power. And the way I kind of view power is really control over one's own life. And when you define power or freedom like that, incels obviously come up shorter than most women. So perhaps that's it doesn't go with the narrative to acknowledge them, and they're not a good victim in that sense.
Do you think there's also a kind of hyperfixation on consent, which is implicitly sexist, and we don't realize it? So, for instance, it's seen as absolutely unacceptable for men to feel entitled to sex from women because that violates the consent of women norms, which are that you have to get the most extreme affirmative consent possible to stay out of the rapist arena. But yet, when it comes to male consent, for instance, to having children, or allowing a woman to use his sperm to impregnate her, we're far more lax about that. We're far more lax about consent for things that are like rape, as long as women are doing them to men. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would, and I would actually say it's a completely underexplored topic. That it's so kind of not front and center in our mind. There's a lot of research that shows we morally typecast men and women, with women as kind of passive victims and men as agentic, criminals or active agents. So yeah, I definitely would say that. I would say that the consent thing, the violation of women's decisions with who, when, and how to have sex is an ultimate violation, evolutionarily speaking, and just ultimately, and perhaps for a long, long time, that had been violated. So now any kind of sense in a conversation that we might be going back to that, where women's choice might be taken away, causes people to bristle. But it might kind of, it's maybe it's an uncomfortable truth that we have to reckon with, that for a long, long time, women were either settling with men that they didn't really want out of economic necessity, and now that they no longer have to, they're just not. Or even further back than that, they're kind of women as a sexual resource or reproductive resource was controlled by men. So any kind of sense that the conversation might be going back to usurping their freedom of choice again is very sensitive, I imagine. Yeah.
Now, can you understand why somebody might be particularly sensitive about this when reading your work? Because it does feel, in your piece at least, that one of the things that you're complaining about is that because women have all this freedom to choose whoever they want, they're choosing sort of the top percentile of men. And most of men are having to choose the bottom percentile of women.
So that's just kind of like an attraction inequality that's playing out. So for a long time, we had strict societally enforced monogamy that kind of ensured most men will have a chance at getting a wife and a job if they get a good job because of economic necessity of women to kind of, get a man with a good job was the goal for a long time. But now women are rapidly outpacing men in education and the workplace, but their mate preferences are still for highly educated and wealthier men. But there's less and less of those comparatively. So it creates a culturally skewed sex ratio of highly educated and demanding women that there literally is not enough good men out there to meet that preference. So that means that the minority of men that women do want, the highly educated, high status guys, they actually don't care if a woman is highly educated or not. So women are having to compete with educated and uneducated women for a shrinking pool of guys at the top who are less likely to commit to one person, because why would they if they can, they're the scarcity, they're the scarce resource. So the game has to be played on their terms. So you get a kind of a conspicuous mating system that's both polygynous and polyandrous, but with a high variance of success for men, but low variance of success for women. Most women will get a chance, and most men won't. And online stuff is kind of exasperating this stuff as well, making it worse, because, it's just less reasons for these men to commit. And you've got an unusual situation that seems to be. Now, I would never try to roll back our cultural success of providing more freedom of choice for women. But with that freedom of choice, I would probably suggest we could maybe try to encourage women to reward somewhat different things, like perhaps reward stay-at-home dads or things like that. But it just doesn't happen. I cite one study in my essay that 5% of young women, only 5% of young women, are interested in a relationship with a man who works part-time or not at all. So, that doesn't encourage men to kind of take that route.
Okay. What would you say to somebody who says what you're describing is an unfortunate paradox, but it's a paradox rather than a social evil, because this is what happens when you give people, and women in particular, the freedom to choose to mate with who they want to. And that's such an amazing thing for women to have that they haven't had historically, that we just have to accept this as a precondition of women having freedom. What would you say to that?
I can totally sympathize with that view. And the freedom of choice, I think, is actually a better net good. I would never want to roll that back just for a more egalitarian mating market. But what I would say, while we celebrate that, can we not also acknowledge how uncomfortable that is for a significant amount of men who are disenfranchised now as well, and who are going to cause problems for society and themselves if we don't address that problem in some way or with any sort of sympathy. It's not enough to just say, well, women have a lot of freedom now and they're acting on it, and most men are losing out. So what? We all have to deal with the backlash of incel, because, historically, single young men with low investment in the future have lashed out at society. Now, there's a lot of theories why young men aren't doing that to a great extent now, because the theory is that they may be pacified by pornography or just online worlds that kind of distract them from lashing out at society. But I don't know why we can't have sympathy for those men, or try to sympathize with their plight while still celebrating freedom of choice.
What would you say to somebody who says, with self-described incels, when they make
Mm-hmm.
themselves look like victims of women not choosing them, there's an elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is the reason they're not getting sex is because they can't find women who they're attracted to who want them back. There might be plenty of women who they're not attracted to who want them, but because they want to be with, women who look like porn stars or Gal
Mm-hmm.
Gadot, and that those are the only women who get them hard, that's why they're not having sex, and that's why they're involuntarily celibate. It's because they feel entitled to the top of the
Mm-hmm.
female mating hierarchy. What would you say to that?
That's very interesting, because that's one of the things I'm going to study in my dissertation as well, whether incels just have too high standards for their own mate value. I personally don't think it's true. I think when you're a low mate value person, you are very sensitive to your place in the hierarchy. Men typically will consider a wider range of women attractive than women who tend to be a lot more choosy than men. So it would be unusual if this group just had too high standards. What I think is more likely is that it's just more seductive for them to embrace the victim identity than participate in the mating market. I think that's more likely than them to just have too high a standard. But yeah, hopefully I can find out whether some of that is at play. I personally don't think so. I think incels they're very attuned to their place in this mating market. But what I will say is, I think that once they build this fatalistic worldview, they try to find as much evidence as they can to fit with that, to the extent that I think they would almost, I don't know what they would do if a woman asked them out on a date. There's some of them where I'm thinking like that would jar with their worldview so much that I think they would actually almost reject that, which is strange. So there's a lot going on with the seductiveness of victim identity, that they're embracing that instead of participating in the mating market, which they just don't find that fruitful, or it's not that important to them.
Now, one of the things that's really interesting about what you're saying is it's sort of suggesting, if you're right about this, that being lower on the mating hierarchy, that is being more socially awkward, being poorer, being uglier, being fatter, that makes you have a more elastic, tolerant sexuality.
Well, that's actually evolutionarily, it's a good strategy. If you're a low value, mate value guy, if you think evolutionary for a minute, it's not a good strategy for you to only aim at the high status, high value women, because you're not likely to get them or keep them. You're better at recalibrating your preferences. And a lot of mate preference studies show this, that a kind of self-preservation mechanism is people tend to mate assortatively. You don't tend to, mate outside your league so much, because it's just not, if our ancestors who did that are not likely to pass on their genes, right? They're likely to be rejected all their life. It's not a good strategy. So it would be unusual if you had this group kind of misfiring their mating efforts to such an extent.
Well, what is quite fascinating to me about this is, even though what you're saying is grounded in science, it seems to be sort of challenging this assumption in popular culture, at least, which seems to be a product of having a good progressive education. That is, you are not in control of your sexuality. It's biologically determined in advance of you.
I find that such an interesting point as well, because in evolutionary psychology, we're often criticized with what's called the naturalistic fallacy, by appealing to something as fixed in nature. And even though I've never heard an evolutionary psychologist say this, the myth is that we appeal to nature and say that that's good and that's right and that's what we should do. We never say that, but that's the kind of straw man argument against us. So people tend to rail against the naturalistic fallacy, except about sexuality. Sexual tastes and sexual orientation, we're told, are just born this way. We're fixed in that. We cannot do anything to change it. And I tend to think that it's a little bit more fluid than that. I certainly think it's more fluid than gender appears to be to me. I think we have a little bit more autonomy to flex on our sexuality in response to different contexts. So, and that's the way mating strategies always are in different cultures. If you find yourself in a culture with a high sex ratio of more women to men, your mating strategies change. Evolutionary theory predicts this in different cultures. So certainly I think that mating strategies and sexuality can be more malleable or flexible to the environment you find yourself in. And you actually even find there's one study that can show that online incel activity increases in areas of the world where there's high income inequality and skewed sex ratios of women to men. So they can even geolocate high levels of incel activity just by knowing enough about the environment.
So what an example of this sort of sexual flexibility that people say is impossible be when, for instance, the kind of female porn star who was straight goes into porn, starts having sex with women because of the market pressure, and then finds she likes it, and then by the end of her career in porn, she says she's bisexual. On your view, is that actually a real biologically possible thing to have happened?
Oh, I think sexual flexibility and alternate sexual strategies are certainly malleable based on the culture or environment you find yourself in. So there's in Paraguay, there's a tribe called the Ache, and they have 50% more women than men, which means they're very promiscuous. And if you had the other way around, if you had 50% more men than women, and they've even studied this on university campuses, countries, cities, if you have more men than women, men will adopt the socio-sexual strategies of the women and tend to commit more and be more long-term relationship oriented. So I absolutely think it's flexible, depending on the environment you find yourself in. What you're mentioning there about the bisexual porn star, I think what's interesting there is that her flexing on her sexuality seems to be something that's kind of celebrated as almost kick-ass feminism type thing in a way that other flexings of sexuality might not be.
Okay, so but you think it is at least biologically possible for a heterosexual self-identifying woman to make herself bisexual?
I don't know if you could. I mean, it's possible for her sexuality to develop and flex and change, I think. How consciously you could do it? Could you set out to say, I'm going to now commit to a mission to try and change something? I think it would be a lot easier for some people to do that and a lot harder for other people. I think that's where it's actually more of a spectrum or a dial or a fluid thing, depending on the person. And I think a lot of it would have to do with what's called your socio-sexual orientation, your attitude towards, like I always make the point, it would be a lot, it would be more comfortable for me to intend to do something than a lot of other men I know, it's just based on your personality or your attitude.
Okay, so but would you say, for instance, it's possible for somebody who only likes junk food to make themselves develop a taste for vegetables?
How it links with diet, I'm not really sure. I mean.
Well, it's taste. If you can make yourself like vegetables, can you, as a heterosexual person, make yourself like homosexual sex encounters?
I don't think it's as similar in character as taste, because it's different mechanisms and urges being pulled. But it's I certainly think people are more fluid on it than you're born this way, it's innate, you couldn't change if you tried. And actually, that's kind of a morally bankrupt idea in my mind, because it kind of implies if you could change your sexuality, you would and you should. That it's something wrong about you, but you just can't change it, so we have to accept it. Mm-hmm. Being gay or a minority sexuality it's not wrong in and of itself, and we just have to accept it. It's okay. It would be okay whether it was a choice or whether it's fixed. So when you say things like born this way, I couldn't help it if I tried, it kind of implies that if you could change it, you would and you should. which seems a bit morally bankrupt to me.
Interesting. So let's bring this back to the incel discussion then. So one of the fascinating things about this sort of perspective about flexibility that you have is it sort of implies to me at least that like the woman who is only attracted to the extremely attractive man is expressing a sexuality which is a function of her social privilege. That if you took her social and mating privilege away, her sexual choices or her sexual desires would get more expansive and eclectic. Would you say that's true?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, we've seen that when women have had less freedom, to what extent were women explicitly unhappy in the marriages they were settling for centuries? Was that consciously felt within them? Probably not. They probably just made the best of it. So yeah, it's a tough time for women to get the sex and love they want now, because the minority of men at the top are not behaving the way that the women want them to, because they're the scarcity. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So that they're finding that the guys they want, which are less and less, the vanishingly small minority at the top, are behaving like scoundrels because, well, why wouldn't they? Because they're the ones in demand.
But is their behavior like scoundrels, as you describe it, part of what makes them attractive?
So there is some studies that show that women are attracted to dark triad traits, which is kind of psychopathy, Machiavellianism, and I can't think of the third one. These kind of dark personality traits in men.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of that might be because it's kind of miscalibrated towards our ancestral environment, where women relied upon men for physical protection and for resources a lot more. They might be kind of missing out on more, kind of nicer traits that would be nicer in the modern world. It's I always make the joke that sexual selection shapes the mind of one sex, shapes the physical features and personality features of the other sex. So I joke to women, if they want different behavior from men, start rewarding different things. If women in the morning were marrying stay-at-home dads, that was their top mate preference, then men would start doing that in high droves of numbers, in my opinion.
Do you think there's an element of the desires of women that you're describing, which is evolutionarily dysfunctional? So they are attracted to the top percentage of men on the mating hierarchy, but it also is the case that men who are in that top percentage have traits that are not desirable for long-term marriage or family situations.
Yeah, it's called evolutionary mismatch in mating. That the mate preferences are miscalibrated or kind of better calibrated to an ancestral environment where they relied upon men for physical protection and resources. Women don't need men for the resources element now, so they're not looking for the kind of the stable, committed kind of guy. They want commitment, but they also want just the guy with top genes. So they're saying, well, I already have my kind of security needs taken care of, so I'm free now to act on my other mate preferences, the genetic ones. So that's why they're aiming for the small minority of, if you've got a single 35-year-old woman now who already has a child, I'm thinking of some friends of mine, they're not in a mad panic to try and find a partner. They're okay. They want love. They want a top guy. They want a guy with someone they're really attracted to. They're not, whereas maybe 30 years ago, 40 years ago, they'd be kind of pressured to find a guy and settle down. And, that pressure is not there anymore. And that's, in my view, a good thing, as long as we can also have sympathy for or have some way of addressing this underclass of men that aren't being selected for. We have to do better than just laughing at incels because this is happening. That's not good for anyone.
Okay, this is where the evolution gets a bit complicated. Well, the evolutionary drives, rather. Because on the one hand, it sounds like you're saying that women are biologically predisposed for evolutionary reasons to pick high-status males. But on the other hand, it sounds like you're saying that the environment can change that. If, say, the women lose their high status, let's say because they become older or unattractive or something like that.
Well, women are choosier than men typically because of greater obligatory parental investment. They have a lot more to lose by choosing the wrong guy, right? Men are as choosy when it comes to choosing for a long-term relationship. But just these guys at the top are now they're using a short-term mating strategy rather than long-term because they have a lot more options. So yeah, it's not like your mating decisions are never like that fully conscious, but they've kind of materialized in that way reliably across culturally for well-studied kind of phenomenon. Women have chosen mates across or up status hierarchies.
Okay, but I suppose what I'm trying to get at here is how much of this desire in women that is a problem, how much of this is sort of pre-conscious and biological on your view, and how much of it just is a function of being treated as a princess in society?
Well, I think it makes sense. I don't think it's a case of being treated as a princess in society. That they actually they're free to act on their mate preferences for and that's a good thing. So it's not like, I think there is evolutionary reasons for women to mate across or up the status hierarchy. I don't think it's just a product of we've made them like princesses, and I don't think that's a culturally imposed taste.
I think I should have been more specific in that question. That was actually worded badly. All right, suppose there are women in society who are kind of treated like princesses because they're like extremely beautiful, rich movie stars. Let's take somebody like Gal Gadot who plays Wonder Woman, right?
Right.
We can both agree that she's kind of treated like a princess, right?
Okay, yeah, celebrities are kind of worshipped, and attractiveness privilege is certainly a big thing, I would say, yeah.
Okay, so suppose that the pool of mates that she's going to choose from is going to be either other rich movie star men or like really rich executive guys, guys who run galleries, maybe another rich artist who maybe isn't a movie star but who's really successful and, really well esteemed. Like she's going to be choosing mates from like the top of the male mating hierarchies in terms of what is socially valued in a man. The question is that for you a product of her social situation, of her being Gal Gadot, or is that what any woman would do because that's just evolutionary biology and hardware operating?
Yeah, I think our evolutionary psychology plays out in the context it finds itself in. And you see this actually in mate partnerships where initially a man and a woman are kind of similar mate value, and then perhaps the guy loses his job, or the woman maybe loses a lot of weight, and the mate value discrepancy appears. Her mate preferences change, or his mate preferences might change alternatively if he got a job promotion, or she gained a lot of weight suddenly, or something like that. That happens a lot. It's in constant flux. So your mate preferences will respond to the options you have around you.
So it sounds like, on your view, her desires are more socially constructed than biological when it comes to the exclusivity of a very small set of men to satisfy them.
So remember also that our mate preferences, for the most part of our evolutionary history, we grew up in small bands of maybe 150 people. So the options available to people now are just crazy much more than we're kind of evolutionarily used to. So yeah, absolutely, that you'll make the best decision for you that you can find, you know. You'll often find, you know, if a woman in a small town or something, that before she knows her full mate value, a guy might try and kind of pin her down and get her to commit, and kind of guard her from. And when she grows up a little bit more, she kind of comes to her early 20s or whatever it might be, and she learns, oh, actually, this small town hero guy that I'm committed to, I could actually get way better than him. He understood that when he was trying to pin me down. Now that I know that, I'm going to, you know, you see it all the time. So yeah, knowing how to calibrate your mate value with your mate preferences is something that's always going on.
Wow, that's fascinating to me, because that sort of implies, in my imagination, something like this. Suppose Gal Gadot lives next to a guy who's like a fat computer programmer called Jerry. And she enjoys his company when they have, you know, little interactions, when, you know, he's taking away her bin or whatever to be nice. But she's clearly not thinking of him as like a potential mate, because she's got all these other mates to choose from that are much more higher status and attractive than Jerry. But then suppose Gal Gadot gets a thyroid condition where she suddenly gains a lot of weight and it's not in her control. Her movie career ends because of this, and she gets lots of abuse online because she now has a double chin and is chubby and doesn't look anything like Wonder Woman anymore. Now, suddenly she starts to find Jerry attractive.
Yeah,
Do you think that's possible?
Likely. Absolutely, that's possible. Now, it might not come online consciously in her mind, like, oh, I know I've gained a lot of weight, I better start looking at different guys. But she might actually, you know, be more responsive to different options around her. That's absolutely the way your evolutionary psychology will work. You take cues from the environment around you. How are men responding to me? How do men typically treat me? All of this stuff. And we even know from studies that the most attractive women, they want it all in terms of mate preferences. Looks, wealth, commitment, everything, because they're in that bargaining position where they can make those demands. You absolutely, I think you calibrate your own mate value into your mate preferences within the context you find yourself.
Now that is very, very interesting and a little bit scary to me, because one of the things that it suggests, at least, is one way to solve this problem that you're describing about men, you know, the majority of men being outside of women's preferences, is, it seems like what you're saying is that's a function of women's mating privilege socially. If we took away women's privilege, they would start to fancy more men lower down the mating hierarchy, and we would solve this problem. Would you say that's not accurate?
Well, yeah, but you'd create a different problem by kind of trying to socially engineer women's mate preferences, or kind of restrict their freedom to act on their mate preferences. And that's what we had done for centuries. The societally enforced monogamy was the norm. And, you know, a woman who was 30 and single would be socially pressured to go find a guy to settle with. And suddenly her mate preferences would go lower, right? Then, so you can see how it plays out. That social pressure isn't there anymore, and it results in maybe the incel problem. But, you know, there was another problem before that women were being pressured to settle with men that they didn't really want. And, you know, people always worry about the backlash of incel violence, but it's actually a lot less than the backlash of jealous boyfriend violence. Because jealous boyfriends who try to restrict and control their female partner, that's a way bigger predictor of violence, intimate partner violence, than lonely incels lashing out at society, which is rare, but does happen.
What would you say to this strategy for dealing with the problem of women liking too small a portion of men at the top of the mating hierarchy? The reason why women feel they have the mating value to be as picky and as choosy as they are is because men have given them that. Men have treated them like they are the bee's knees, you know, like they are almost like gifts for men rather than equals. And if men stopped doing that, if men were a bit less, if men were a bit less favorable and awestruck over beautiful women, the mating value of those women in their heads, in their psychology, would go down, and then they would have a much larger array of men who could satisfy them. How is that as a solution to this problem?
I don't know how you would do it. I don't know how you would make men care less about attractive women. Just the mania with which men act to impress women.
Oh no, you wouldn't make them careless. You would tell them, don't express that to women, because if you express it to women, they'll get choosier, and if they get choosier, they probably won't choose you.
I don't know. It sounds a little bit kind of like almost too dark pickup artist arena type stuff. I would more like try to steer the conversation towards, can we decide to culturally consider different traits as high status, or a wider range of traits as sexy? You know, women, could you begin to value stay-at-home dads a bit more? And I think you could. And I think progress will be made on that. You know, I don't like to have such an adversarial attitude of men versus women that it's kind of like we can't let them know their value to us, or, you know, I don't know. I try to encourage men to kind of to improve if they can, but also that to not define themselves as the only way, the only symbol of success is if you can attract an attractive woman. I would like to try and say that you can have a full life without that, even if you don't have access to it.
Well, what's interesting is my proposal, you sort of immediately interpret it as a very dark sort of pickup arts man versus woman sort of solution. But personally, I know a lot of women that would prefer that over being told you must be attracted to this, that, and the other if you're not. Because I know a lot of women who say that when men are in control of their desires and they don't go gaga over a beautiful woman, they find that attractive in men.
Oh yeah, I mean, someone who's secure and not kind of you know, putty in someone's hands is going to be more attractive. So yeah, it's more kind of like integrating attraction in a more better adjusted way, that it's not like put up on this pedestal that it's the main thing, and if I don't have it, I'm such a loser, and all this stuff. And then by focusing on yourself and developing yourself as a project in its own right, then you'll, by virtue of that project, become more attractive anyway. But I don't really know how we'd accomplish the kind of societal level lowering of women's mate value. I think women are always going to be of higher mate value than men. That's evolutionary, because they are a more valuable evolutionary resource than men.
What would you say to somebody who says these problems that you're describing are actually a lot more new than the evolutionary story is giving credit for? Because we've had a sexual revolution when women suddenly decided that it was fun recreation to turn on men in the most visceral ways possible, whether it's in the street, on billboards, in a bikini, in a porn film, in a regular film, in ways that were not possible for them to do that in previous parts of human history, or at least previous parts of Western human history. And the fact that men are now being exposed to all of this sexual stimuli for the first time in the public sphere without having to rely on their imaginations, this is why women are being so highly valued when they're attractive. It's because men are being bludgeoned with eye candy, and we haven't had that as a norm in our evolutionary past.
Yeah, but see, I find when things like this are brought up, people say that, and they also say people are being desensitized. So it's both supernormal stimuli driving us crazy horny around the billboards and pornography and television, but also we're becoming desensitized and it doesn't work on us anymore. So how can both, I'm not saying you're saying that, but I've heard commentators say both those things before, and that doesn't make sense to me. The supernormal stimuli might actually also be doing something else, Greg. It might actually be giving incels and who are watching a lot of pornography or spending a lot of time online, it might give them kind of counterfeit fitness cues that they're actually achieving evolutionary success without real world outcomes. So that might be the reason why they're not. Typically, men who don't have sexual access, young men, really lash out at society. That's not happening on a mass scale now, and that may be because of these counterfeit fitness cues. I do think supernormal stimuli is around, and there is a kind of a culture of sexiness. So men are kind of find themselves enmeshed in this sexy world, but told not to notice it, which is a little bit unusual. And I just think we could do better to acknowledge attractiveness privilege and erotic capital. My more honest female friends will tell me honestly that they completely lean on their erotic capital as a type of power. Other women might be more in self-deluded about it or self-denial, and other women might actually really not notice the ways in which they have erotic privilege. But yeah, I think we can have maybe acknowledge that a little bit more in society. Yeah.
But do you think that the sexual capital that especially beautiful women have now, that's gone up as a function of this new hypersexualized capitalist society we find ourselves living in, that we've only really had in its most extreme form since the 90s when porn became mainstream?
I'm not sure. I think we always would have valued attractiveness privilege a lot. But yeah, it's kind of a big part of people's identity now is to be sexy. When that kind of came online or really peaked, I'm not exactly sure.
Because I was thinking, like in the past, maybe as a man, your mate preferences would be different because you would not be expecting to see the most attractive women all the time in front of you in billboards and then eventually in things that you can have orgasms looking at. You would expect to kind of see the women that you might actually sleep with. And so your sexuality was more focused on women that you thought you could sleep with.
Well, that was also true because the women in your kind of milieu, there was less of them, right? It was who was in your town or in your city. Whereas now it's who's on your dating app within a radius that, you can have thousands of potential options there. So evolutionarily, the cue that you're getting is there is an abundance of women out there, but a lot of them aren't picking most men, which is so, it's kind of, it's a big evolutionary mismatch for sure.
Now, getting back to incels, one criticism that people often have of incels is that there's a sense that attraction to a large extent is based on making yourself desirable to other people by doing things that are good for yourself, that are psychologically healthy, that are responsible, especially if you're a man. And if you don't do these things, of course you're going to be an incel. But that has more to do with you than any problem in society, or especially any problem with female desire. What would you say to that?
I think that's interesting because I'd take that one step further and say that as soon as you attach the explicit goal of attracting women to any form of self-development, if I say, we had the example of Barack Obama in his biography. He wrote that he read about certain books or certain intellectuals with the specific goal of trying to impress women. And there was articles written about this, how misogynistic it was and how he was trying to trick women into, thinking he had the personality like them. I mean, attracting women is one of the most useful goals to motivate men to do anything. So, it's definitely going to be one of the big motivators to help men want to self-develop. But as soon as you attach that explicit goal of, oh, this guy is developing himself, or he's going to get that master's degree, or he's going to build himself up in the gym or whatever, or read those books or whatever it might be, as soon as you attach the explicit goal that that's being done to attract women, it's seen as unpalatable. It's seen as, oh, that's not good. That shouldn't be the motivation. When, really, that's been the motivation for men and women to self-improve for eons.
But do you think there's a sense in which the mating hierarchies have a kind of justice built into them? Because if you make yourself an unpleasant person, that's what makes you an incel. If you're a pleasant person, you eventually find a mate, and that's that. What would you say to that?
I think that's that we are kind of over leaning on the reason incels are incels is because they're horrible people. I think that that doesn't actually take into account how much of sexual attraction is kind of immutable or based on things like physical attraction, height, stuff, resources, and things like that. I think it's a nice idea for us to think, nice guys will get the women eventually. It's not all about looks, you know, and everybody will have an example of someone who, a not very physically attractive guy or a short guy like myself who manages to attract women. But, you know, those are the exceptions, not the rule. And it doesn't, it's kind of demeaning to the challenges that incels face, in my opinion. And I think it's kind of disingenuous for us to say, oh, the reasons why incels are incels is just because they're horrible.
What would you say to somebody who says, look, I go on the street every day. I notice that there's a huge difference in attractiveness between the people on the billboards and in the movies and in the magazines and the people I see on the street. Most people on the street range from above average to well below average, and probably the median is average. And most of them have families. So if you can't get a partner, you're quite unusual. Most people, even unattractive people, have partners. What would you say to that?
Well, that's kind of, you know, that is the way people make mating decisions. They go more towards their own level. They're not just dissatisfied with their partner because they see billboards. They're kind of happy to have a partner. But yeah, you know, that's the way it's been for most of the last maybe century or so, is that most men had something to offer women, whereas now that's kind of been flipped. They don't. So the game is being played by that small minority at the top rather than by everyone on an equal footing. So it's not, you know, it's not the case that the once upon a time, the average guy, just by virtue of getting a job and doing the normal things, would probably have found himself with a wife and kids. Whereas now that doesn't seem to be the case. And I think something that also can't be understated is the importance of how difficult it is to get a house on your own now. But you almost have to get a house with a partner. And that's a double whammy for incels then as well, because it's hard to even get on the capital ladder without a partner who's also earning a good job. So, you know, that's a double hit.
Another thing you've written about in your piece is about how a lot of mating today is happening on the internet. And you've got some really interesting graphs about how people who are in couples today have such a high percentage of having met on the internet compared to previous decades. And that's really fascinating to me because my wife I met on the internet way back in 2003.
Wow. And we're early adopter.
So we've been together for 18 years. I was wondering what you think about this. I've seen a lot of stuff recently about how dating apps are really horrible for men because the top percentage of women are being flooded with male overtures, and most of them they ignore. And most men, even highly attractive men, get diddly squat from the women on the websites.
Yeah.
I was curious if you think that the problem here maybe is that women are not in a receptive mood online, especially in dating website contexts, compared to offline. And that if incels would target women offline, they'd have better chances of getting girlfriends. What do you think?
Yeah, I think there is an element of truth to that because, you know, the online stuff, it kind of dilutes the dynamism of real world attraction, and personality can't come into play because of the sheer numbers of messages women are getting. It's very hard to let your personality shine through to overcompensate for your lack of physical attractiveness when you're one of 50 messages that woman has got that day. That's a very tall order. And my advice to incels, and I never claim to know the answers. It's a very complex problem and difficult to grapple with. But my advice is to try and maybe find your niche, your arena, where I encourage. There's no point in an incel. I take myself, for example. I'm about 5'7", pretty short guy. There's no point in me going to the most popular club in Birmingham and trying to pull the woman there who likes the hulky gym guy, right? She's just not going to be impressed by anything I have to offer. Whereas if I go to intellectual debate or to battle of ideas or something like that, that's where I might shine. So there's and I should double down on those arenas rather than trying to compete with Chad in a nightclub, right? And I think that's where incels fall down, because they have a very superficial view of what attraction is. And status can be achieved in lots of different arenas. So I would encourage them to double down on what they find their thing is, whether it's board games, video games, whatever it might be, and try and find women within that milieu where they might actually be able to build up some status, rather than just saying, there's not just one status hierarchy for men. No, there's tons of domains that status hierarchies are built around. So find the one that works for you.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I think when I was a teenager, although I would never have used the label, I was probably an incel.
Interesting.
And I stopped being an incel when I was about 19 because I realized that I couldn't pick up women at all without creating humiliating experiences for myself.
Yeah, it's anxiety inducing, right?
But if I didn't try and pick women up, if I just hung out with a bunch of women, about 1 out of 10 of them would be interested in me, and that 1 out of 10 would be attractive.
Wow.
And between the time I was 19 and the time I met my wife, I did have 3 girlfriends, all of whom I found attractive. They didn't work out for all sorts of other reasons. But what I figured out was the way that I could overcome being an incel, which is what I basically was as a teenager, was stop picking up women, start talking to them.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of like what I was saying. Just kind of double down on what works for you anyway. Shine in the places you want to shine anyway. And, you know, if nothing else, taking that focus and that pressure valve of I've got to pick up women, taking that away, it's got to be a pressure release anyway, I would say. But another point that can't be understated for incels is just give it time. Most of the incels who are complaining online or active online, they're early 20s and younger. So, you know, by virtue, men get more attractive as they approach their 30s. You know, a 20-year-old woman is interested in, you know, guys 25 to 30 as well, not necessarily in other 20-year-old men. So it's the growing up in itself, you'll achieve higher status most of the time than when you're 20.
You're right. A lot of this is, I think, men don't hear some uncomfortable truths about mating. And one of them is that a lot of precocious boys who are very intelligent between the ages of, say, 7 and 12, like I was, adults will tell you, oh, the girls will love you when you grow up.
Yeah.
They should never do that.
Or they should tell you it'll be a lot older than you think.
They should tell you, no, they'll love you when you're about 35. But when you become a man and you become really horny, that's when they're going to like you the least. That's where you're going to have to work the hardest to get a girlfriend.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, I agree with that. And telling people, and this is where informing people about evolutionary psychology would actually help as well, that just the fact of knowing that more women will be interested in you when you're 30 than when you're 20 would probably help a lot too. And conversely for women as well, that their kind of prime attractiveness window is earlier than perhaps they might be told now. Now, I don't agree with a lot of this extreme manosphere rhetoric of saying that once a woman is over 30, she's hit the wall and she has no value anymore. That's ridiculous. But But there is a certain element of truth to it that men are more attracted to younger women and women prefer slightly older men. So it's kind of asymmetrical kind of windows of power, let's say.
In some ways, it feels like the culture we live in, especially with regards to teenagers today, the post-pornification, sexual liberation world that we live in today, makes those homespun harsh truths you were describing a lot harder to accept if you're a teenager, because when you're a teenager, you're inundated with all of this extreme, visceral sexual imagery of women, like doing things to you that are making you come in way more intense ways than like previous generations would have experienced from female strangers doing stuff in media. And if you grow up with that, you tend to think, oh, I'm going to get access to all of this as soon as I turn 18. As soon as I turn 18, I'm going to actually get to touch these people and not just watch them. And then when you're 18 and you find out, no, actually, this is the time they want you the least.
Yeah, it can be frustrating. And you can understand why someone might have a couple of those anxiety-inducing experiences that don't yield any reward, how they might decide, I'll actually retreat to a victim identity here where I get to bitch and moan about this situation and how unfair it is. And meanwhile, I'll just placate myself with porn or whatever it might be. And, you know, that's going to get more and more with virtual reality sex robots. But maybe that's okay. You know, maybe that's a good pacifier in the meantime.
Do you think porn has distorted people's expectations of sex, and that's in large part what it partly explains the incel phenomenon?
Not really, because when you hear about this, that porn distorts expectations of sex, what type of porn? Because if you go onto a porn site, there's so much variety out there. And, you know, I hear this about, well, porn is making young men more sexually violent. And I'm just thinking, why is it only that specific type of porn that's influential on men, but dominatrix porn and all the other types of porn that's out there has completely got no effect? No one is worried about this. So that, I don't know whether that affects behavior. You know, any study that's ever been done on pornography has shown that it's tracked a reduction in sexual violence. So if anything, similar to like violent video games, it's keeping otherwise dangerous men in online worlds actually reduces sexual violence than increases.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think people in the past always worried about violence in porn or the most extreme pornography. But the worry I have about porn is actually about the vanilla porn. And that is, if you grow up thinking you can find on your computer the woman who is most stimulating to you, the woman who gets you off the hardest with her body, and the next day you can get the next woman who does that for you because you're bored of the first woman. Does that give you a realistic psychological template for what to expect when it comes to actual sex? I don't know that it does.
I don't know. I find that people probably use pornography to explore what their desires might be and to develop them more than otherwise when they meet a woman. That's the only kind of canvas on which to play around with their sexual fantasies. I don't think that's that safe either. So, you know, perhaps listeners might bristle at this idea, but better porn education or help young men and women integrate porn into their own sex lives might be useful. But I don't know if it's giving these unrealistic expectations. There's no real, I can't, people might say differently, but I don't think there's an epidemic of men out there who are dissatisfied with the sex that they're getting from women, other than they're not getting it at all. So it's not as if incels are just disappointed that the sex they're getting isn't like on porn. They're just not getting any. When they get it, they're not disappointed with it. Men aren't dissatisfied. If anything, actually, you could flip the script and point to porn as unrealistic of male body expectations, you know, in terms of performance, in terms of, you know, the size of penis that's average on pornography. All penises on pornography I've seen are pretty much circumcised, which is arguably a harm against men and boys. So we never really talk about unrealistic body expectations or performance expectations towards men. We only ever see it towards women.
That's true. Maybe in a way, I'm sanitizing what I'm saying too much, and I should be more blunt. Maybe
Go
the
ahead.
worry I have is that porn for a lot of people is better than sex, because porn can give men everything they want from women apart from the actual touching.
Yeah,
And that's a hard thing to have on the one hand, and then have to interface or integrate with a life where you have sex with women, but you really do not get everything that you want.
that's right. And also, it's hard to get it in the first place, and you might have to go through a lot of anxiety. So yeah, exactly. In a way, you can't blame men for retreating to that instead of participating in the mating market. And that's only going to get more realistic, more satisfying, more seductive. But what level of discomfort is saved for women in terms of men? If those men were out trying to get with them all the time, there would be a lot of collateral damage in terms of men approaching women and stuff like that they don't like. Women complain about being approached sexually a lot, and that is, I imagine, very uncomfortable for a lot of women. If the men that they're not interested in are stopping approaching them, is that arguably a net good? Is it bad? It's weird though, because we might be heading for this kind of stratified society whereby a very small minority actually participate in the mating market. The others retreat, artificially satisfy their sexual needs, and it becomes almost a luxury endeavor for high status guys. That's a grim view.
Yeah. Do you think that this is a product of the fact that we've freed all these things in men and women through liberation, through the sexual liberation of the 60s and 70s, through the commodification of sexuality, through pornography, etc. And what these liberations have basically exposed is that female sexual desire and male sexual desire kind of clash. They're not really all that compatible with each other unless you have significant limitations on both men and women.
Yeah, perhaps, yeah. It could be what we're seeing with the total freedom of choice isn't that egalitarian. That seems to be the case.
So it sounds like, and this is maybe a dystopian scenario or a hopeful one, depending on how you interpret it, which is in order for most men and women to hook up, we have to find ways to incentivize women to have really lower standards. And we have to find ways to incentivize men to have really lower standards. And that's the only way it's going to happen.
I don't think the men having lower standards would make a difference, because those women are still not interested in them. So men lowering their standards, it doesn't matter, because those lower mate value women are still not interested in them. So that's the point.
Oh, in this world,
is that incels lowering their standards wouldn't really help.
Oh, in this world, yes. But in the world where women are incentivized to lower their standards, then the men...
How would you incentivize women to lower their standards?
Take away their high value.
Yeah, I don't think there's the will for anyone to do that, though, even amongst men.
I don't know. It wouldn't be that difficult.
That might be a lot of what... but I'd put back to that pornography and sex work lowers the cost of sex. So it actually does lower women's mate value, because it's in abundance then.
That's interesting. But I suppose it doesn't really lower women's mating value without a high cost. And the high cost is resentment from women. And that's another problem with pornography that you don't see in other things that lower the mate value of women is pornography. I mean, and this is another thing we don't like to talk about, that women who give men everything they want sexually tend to threaten many women.
Yeah,
for various reasons.
Called the horiarchy, where women actually are more cast more social aspersions on promiscuous women than men. That's well-studied phenomenon.
Do you think women have good reasons to be like that?
Of course, because lowering the market value of sex lowers the market value of a resource that they're in control of. The sexual economics theory posits that sex is a resource that women control and commitment is a resource that men control, and that's often in tension, and things affect that market value, like sex ratios, like things like that.
Okay, so what sexual freedom for women has basically done is it's allowed a minority of women to mess up the value of sex for the majority of women.
And that's why you find a backlash against that. Promiscuous women have always incurred the wrath of other women as well. It's called the horiarchy. Their position in the horiarchy is threatened. And that's a well-studied phenomenon, that women are more cutting in social aspersions towards promiscuous women than men. Men, from evolutionary psychology, the insults that we throw at each other are actually evolutionarily derived. So women will cast aspersions on someone's, oh, she's a slut, or she's a whore, or whatever, whereas men will call other men more effeminate and cast aspersions on their masculinity. He's gay or something like that, or he's a wimp. Mm-hmm. They're always linked to what the other sex finds sexually attractive. So it's interesting, no man is, or a man might say, that guy, he's a virgin, or he's an incel. That's not really an insult women throw at each other. Mm-hmm. So you can see how the evolutionary links come in the insults we actually even use for each other.
Okay.
You're lowering the value of that person to the other sex.
So what's interesting is it seems like what actually happens when the promiscuous woman potentially lowers the value of sex for every woman is there's a backlash against the promiscuous woman, and also a kind of ipso facto backlash against men too, in the form of female resentment. And that female resentment makes the value of female sex go up again.
Yeah, it's always in tension. But yeah, certainly there's a kind of a backlash whenever towards promiscuous women, people get very puritanical.
So what you've said, people get puritanical, but you've also given an explanation in terms of evolutionary psychology that sort of suggests that women shouldn't be promiscuous because they're messing with all the other women, aren't they?
Well, I mean, is that the only goal? How egalitarian is sexual selection? Are we all, so, it's not really the way we kind of operate on a group level of, that was like the group level benefits of monogamy came about for a big reason because of that, because the cultural groups that adopted monogamy and made sure of a more egalitarian spread of women led to more flourishing cultures. Now, the kind of the problems that monogamy solved are not as prescient now, like paternal certainty, things like that, because of technology like contraception, and they're not as prescient, but they're playing on our evolved psychology in the same way.
Okay, so you think if women were less promiscuous and less sort of sexually exhibitionistic, this would have no impact whatsoever on the incel problem?
The reason why women would be more promiscuous now is because there's less men that they're interested in. So it's kind of culturally emulating this skewed sex ratio. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So the only way, so it's as if they're at a party and there's only 2 men and 10 women. Whereas if it was the other way around, it would be the men that would have to shift their sexual strategy. They would have to become more long-term relationship oriented. The only reason women would act more promiscuously is because the men that they want are scarce, and that's the only way to kind of to grab them. When they're in the majority, men have to shift their strategy.
But what do you think would happen to the incel if we erased, let's say, the last 50 years of sexual promiscuity and sexually exhibitionistic culture in porn? Would that do absolutely nothing? Would we have exactly the same situation we have now?
I think it's more to do with that women no longer have to settle for those guys. That because they're highly educated themselves, they're highly earning great money themselves, they're free to act on their preferences in a more granular way. They're able to be more demanding. So I think it's more an economic, an unintended consequence of women's liberation into the workplace rather than anything else. So it would be less. I would less focus on, let's dial down the promiscuity and sexual expression. It would actually say, I would actually focus more on telling women, is working 60 hours a week in a corporate office your dream? Or would you prefer working part-time and perhaps a lower status guy who's still interested in you, something like that? I think that's I think that's probably more lead to more human flourishing than restricting women's sexual freedoms of expression.
Okay, so you don't see the incel then as having been impacted in any way by the sexualization of women in the last 50 years? In the sense that you don't think in the absence of that, they would have a higher value and more greater attractiveness to women than they currently do because of their exposure to porn and there may be skewed perceptions of women because of everything being so hypersexualized.
No, I don't think. I think the main reason they're not as attractive to women now is economic. I don't see how. It's not like if those incels weren't subjected to porn and a sexy society that they would behave in a way that makes women want them. I don't think that. I don't see that happening. I think they're not desirable because women are now highly educated and earning a lot of money and want the same.
Okay, well, I would certainly agree with you about like the bottom rung of incels who are incels because of neurological conditions. Let's say they're highly autistic or whatever. But sort of higher level incels, let's say, who don't have anything specifically wrong with them, but who just tend to do things that women don't like. Would you not say that those incels would benefit from the absence of a hypersexualized culture?
I don't see how. How would they? Why would that make them in more demand to women?
Because they wouldn't see women in the way that porn makes you see women.
How does porn make you see women?
As like a bunch of beautiful meat suits that you can get pleasure from, and then throw away to find another meat suit that you can get pleasure from.
But so, like a lot of this, whether it's coming from porn or whatever, it zeroes in on incels because of their horrible personalities, which I don't really think is the case for the most part. I think it is for some, for sure. And I think, but I don't think that's the whole story. And I don't think they'd be in demand. I think average guys are just now finding themselves as incels, whereas once upon a time they would have, by virtue of being able to get a job, become reasonably attractive to women.
So what percentage of incels would you say are just unpleasant people without any specific neurological condition, and that's why they can't get laid?
It's very hard to quantify how much of it is to do with nasty personality, because, there's guys who are very attractive that have nasty personalities that are still attractive despite that. I would think a lot of incels. So the question was, what percentage are just ordinary guys who either have bad personalities or immutable characteristics that aren't attractive to women compared to an actual clinical disorder or something?
Yeah.
So I'm hoping to measure that in my study, which will give us some answers on that. So I don't really know. I can't imagine that the percentage of men who have clinical issues as that high when you consider that the number of incels, the number of men reporting to not have sex within the last year has tripled within the last decade. I can't imagine a high number of those have neurological disorders or a clinical disorder. Now, one study of one incel forum reported that 40% of incels self-reported that they had a mental disability. Mm-hmm. How accurate that is, whether that's clinically diagnosed, whether that's just themselves saying it, whether it's true, but that's just one study. But hopefully I'll have some answers on mine as well in October.
Mm-hmm.
But I can't imagine it's that high. I think we've got to get away from this idea of incels are this very strange phenomenon of type of guy. I think average guys are finding themselves as incels now just because that's the mating market out there.
So when you say average guys, I don't mean to be too prissy about this, but are you imagining a guy who is in every other way a good friend, a desirable coworker, a nice person who will look after you if you have a heart attack in the middle of the street? He'll call the police and so on. He's perfectly acceptable in terms of human relations in every way, except the fact that he can't get a girlfriend.
Potentially, yeah. So, I mean, the question is to ask that question differently. So I told you the statistic there that the number of American men who have reported no sex within the last year has tripled within the last decade. Is it more likely that within the last decade, that portion of men just became awful? Or is this kind of, we have all these articles written about now, even in like New Yorker and things like this, where it says there literally aren't enough good men out there. There's not enough economically attractive men on the marriage market for women. This is a serious progressive line of narrative, that there's not enough economically attractive men for women's taste.
It's a bit like saying there's not enough women with big tits.
Well, you would never write that article the other way around, right?
Yeah.
It's a severe shortage of attractive women out there these days. It just doesn't have the same ring to it, does it? But that's because men are quite satisfied with most women.
Well, that's also because it's men's job to flatter women and make them feel good about themselves no matter where they are in the hierarchy. Whereas women,
that's right. We tend to be pretty satisfied.
Women don't have the same obligation to men socially to do that for them.
That's right. They tend to be the ones who are pursued.
But, I mean...
But women compete for men too, but perhaps to a lesser extent and perhaps only for a smaller minority of the men.
But you do raise a really important problem, which is if there is this large number of men who can't get laid in, what was it, the last 10 years?
Yeah, the last decade.
That either has to be because they either are really horrible in some way, or women are really horrible in some way. It's very implausible.
I don't think either has to be true. I think it just has to be that there is that mismatch problem of women like this. These are women's mate preferences cross-culturally for decades, well-studied phenomenon that it's often been this case to value resources in a mate. And it's just miscalibrated to a world where they can earn big bucks themselves. It needn't be that way, but it is. And how much do you want to try and socially engineer what people's mate preferences should be? I don't know.
Do you think that this situation has evolved the way it has in a weird roundabout way because of men's mate preferences and because of how they behave towards women?
I think both sexes' mate preferences have contributed to the mating market we find ourselves in. It's, absolutely. That's what we see playing out. So that's why I bristle when I hear you say things like either men have become awful or women have become awful, because I don't think either sex acting on their evolved mate preferences makes them horrible. If I was a woman, I'd probably want a high status guy who'd work, and I might work part-time or whatever it might be, you know? But I think that's something we could maybe gear towards, is trying to be more conscious that we can maybe culturally create new metrics of status, like being a very caring father or something like that. We will change that culturally, and we've made cultural changes on that to some degree, just not as fast as we might like.
Mm-hmm. Well, like you, I don't like to imagine a world in which in the past 10 years, one sex or both sex have gotten horrible. But there is
I don't think it's likely.
But there is something that has happened in the last 10 years which makes me think it might be the case that both sexes in different ways have gotten horrible.
Well, I think what would make you act horrible then is if you find yourself in this mating market with a genuine or perceived grievance, and then you find an identity to build around it of incel identity that comes with this hostility towards the other sex. And then you've got feminism, some extreme ends of feminism being similarly hostile to men and their entitlement and all this. And you've got a kind of a outrage machine that encourages abrasive identities to pit yourself against each other. Perhaps that exacerbates problems.
Well, my worry, I suppose, is that in the last 10 years, it's not just feminism. We've had an explosion of misandry. And when you have an explosion of socially normalized misandry, it wouldn't be surprising to me if a generation of young, attractive women were horrible, and then you had a group of men who also became horrible in reaction to that.
Yeah. You can totally see how that would play out. And if you have that worldview, then you can easily find enough evidence to support your hypothesis. If my hypothesis is attractive women are bitchy, I can go out and find a lot of evidence for that, right? Yeah. Whereas if I'm an attractive woman and my hypothesis or my worldview is, oh, men are trash, you can find a lot of evidence for that too, right?
Yeah.
But it incentivizes this that fatalistic kind of worldview, and you can find, it's like I mentioned in our first episode, Greg. If you pick a worldview, you can go out and find tons of evidence for it easily.
Yeah. No, I agree with that.
The world doesn't reward the scout mindset of seeing the world clearly. It rewards soldier mindset of reinforcing your view.
Yeah, I suppose the thing I worry about, though, is everyone, for understandable reasons, when they enter into the gender debate, they either want to describe men as horrible or they want to describe both sexes as not horrible, and there only being some sort of a technical problem, like a mismatching of attractiveness parameters or something. But my worry is when you have an explosion of misandry, that's maybe reflecting a genuine character problem, a genuine character flaw with a generation of people that wasn't there before.
Yeah, it's just, what I would say is it's the social capital that comes with that normalizing of it. It's seen as progressive to kind of say men are trash, which is, I think it's fading a little bit, and the pendulum is swinging back towards more egalitarianism again.
Or white people are trash.
Well, right, maybe it's a different enemy. But it's, for a long time, it was carte blanche on whatever you can say about men. And, and I think a lot of women then just got fed up with that because it's not their experience of men. Their experience of men is largely positive.
Well, I don't know. I mean, for incels, what is the solution? What should we do to deal with this problem?
Well, deal with the problem towards what solution? What is the desired solution? Is the desired solution that we go back to a more egalitarian distribution of men and women, or that people are free to act on their mate preferences, but incels aren't derided and in society? Incels aren't acting hostile and adversarial towards women, and women aren't acting that way back to them. That's an issue of tribalism more broadly, I suppose. In terms of the incel problem, I think housing market would be a big one. Culturally rewarding different things for status, helping encourage incels to not lean towards the victimhood mindset and hostile ideology, to develop themselves in the ways that will actually yield success. culturally attaching status to different things like stay-at-home dads. And then on the other side, maybe telling women, do you want the 60-hour work week and then finding that the guys you want won't commit to you? Or could you recalibrate your mate choice a little bit and perhaps find a loving husband? It's difficult. I'm a freedom-loving guy. I don't like to lean on socially engineer people's mate preferences that much, even though we individually try and do that all the time. You're always trying to convince someone to consider you within their mate preference.
What would you say to a woman who says, when she hears what you said, fuck you, I can take whatever the fuck I want?
Yeah, it's understandable why she might say that, and she might say, it's not my problem. It actually is everyone's problem, I think, because this is society. This is a class of people. This is a group of people that face and represent a particular type of problems in society that affects us. And we've seen in the most tragic of ways how it affects when this ideology takes real hold, and some incels have lashed out at society. Men and women have to live life alongside each other. And we can be each other's best allies in that, or some people would try and encourage us to be very adversarial. I prefer the former.
What would you say to somebody who says, well, look, we've always had incels. It's only recently that, we think about them as a victimhood identity. Maybe the problem is we should just think of them as what we've always thought, which is there's a small percentage of people of both genders who just can't get laid and they have to find happiness through other things.
I think it's just the rapid pace at which that number is growing. That's the concerning bit. Everyone can tolerate a small number of each sex being incels, but it's the kind of asymmetrical sex recession that's disproportionately affecting lower income young men that it seems to be the problem, and the kind of the degree of it rather than the fact that it's happening at all. Some old world solutions to the incel problem, by the way, aren't available to us anymore, such as making Vikings out of them or sending them to die in war. That was done for a lot of surplus young men throughout history. Obviously, we don't do that anymore. Perhaps pacifying a generation of young men with porn is a little bit better than sending them to die in war.
Mm-hmm. What would you say to a woman who isn't so adversarial to you, who doesn't say fuck you, but she says, well, look, I might be interested in one of those young poor men if, my youthful attempts to get a high status man don't work out and I'm all kind of chubby and wrinkly in my 50s and then he's still around, then I might go for him. But when I'm young and beautiful, I want the top. I want nothing but the best. Why can't I have the best?
I mean, that would actually be probably an accurate worldview for her. And, why not? Why shouldn't you if you have the best? That's something Dr. Roy Baumeister, I had a conversation with him and we were just trashing ideas around. And he said, kind of tongue in cheek, someone should match the young incels up with older women who are struggling to find romance as well. I just don't know if that's what either truly desires, because it goes against their evolved mate preferences.
But do you think it's okay, though, for the woman to say, well, I'll date lower status men when my status lowers, when I get fat and chubby and old and wrinkly and I have a double chin and I'm whatever age, then I'll have a more broad mate preference. But when I'm young and hot, I want to enjoy having a narrow mate preference. Why can't I do that?
I think they can, and I think if incels suddenly found themselves high mate value, they would be acting on their mate preferences as well, if they could. It's not like incels are this virtuous group of young men who would behave morally if they could, if the shoe was on the other foot. I don't think there's any reason to believe that. But it's just about perhaps telling a young, attractive woman, if what you want is to secure a long-term stable relationship, going for this high-status guy who's kind of playing around, that maybe won't get you that. Even if you are young and hot, but there's lots of young and hot women, right?
Well, what if she says it's true, it might not work out, in which case, by the time I'm 55 and overweight, I'll settle for the lower status guy if he's still around. But if it works out, I'll live happily ever after and live the fairy tale. So either way, I'm going to do what I want to do. And why should I change just because there's this minority of men, even a growing minority, who can't get laid?
Yeah.
Why is it my problem?
Yeah, I mean, it's not their problem in that sense, and they shouldn't feel obliged to change their mate preferences or to lower their mate standards to solve this issue. That's why I feel like the problem on a societal level has to be just the conversation we have about incels, rather than, oh, quick, there's this sexist group of young men, we've got to get them sex really quick. That's not really, that's too infringing on freedom for my tastes. I would prefer we had just a more charitable cultural conversation about incels.
So is really the change you want actually quite small? All you want is that attractive woman to go from feeling contempt towards the incel to feeling sorry for him? Is that all the change you want?
Perhaps feeling sorry for him. I think there can be, like we spoke about, some cultural changes to reward different things in the mating market. But yeah, ultimately, it's a better understanding of what the problem is, what incels face and represent in society, how to not exasperate it, how to help where they can be helped. And yeah, just to have empathy rather than judging them by the most extreme voices in their community and treating them with scorn. It doesn't help anybody to kind of have this trivialized caricature version of an incel and just pretend, oh, they're just all horrible people. There's just men are getting more and more horrible all the time. It's not likely, is it?
Well, maybe it's not that the majority of them are horrible people. Maybe it's that the majority of them make bad choices when it comes to how to act around women. Have you considered that possibility?
Yeah, certainly. And that's why I say that there is space for this, what I describe as perhaps an ethical pickup artist arena. It just so happens that much of the pickup artist arena is quite somewhat unethical and fixates on trying to kind of trick or manipulate women rather than a kind of how to develop yourself and how to actually, they tend to describe the sexual selection as a lot more zero sum than perhaps it needs to be. But yeah, I think there is a space for an ethical pickup artistry. There is such a thing for women. There's a guy called Matthew Hussey, and it's the most heartwarming, fluffy type material that's really insightful and uplifting for women, helping them understand men romantically. Mm-hmm. And there just doesn't seem to be any equivalent for men yet, because I think people don't like the idea of men working with the specific goal in mind of, I'm building myself up to try and get women. That seems to be distasteful, and I'm not really sure why, because that makes a lot of sense to me.
I think the worry is that men, by their very nature, are constantly trying to manipulate women for sex as much as possible.
Yeah. And I mean, each sex is trying to kind of convince the other towards their optimal sexual strategy. That's it's called the evolutionary arms race framework, where for even within nature, you see, for every kind of sexually exploitative trait that a male will develop, a woman will develop a defense mechanism against it, and it's kind of like the engine room of evolution.
Interesting. So what that defense mechanism has done is it's cast all men as potential manipulators, actually, when some men are extremely disadvantaged and are really just trying to learn techniques to do basic stuff most men can do.
Yeah, I mean, in nature, it's not in women's evolutionary interests to play at the game of sexual selection in a way that suits men completely, because they've got a lot more to lose out by with the parental investment and everything like that. So it's like two hands pulling on a steering wheel, trying to convince the other towards their strategy.
Do you worry that if there's a greater acceleration of ordinary men who women find unattractive, because women are going for the very top percentage of attractive men, that if this number of ordinary men who are disenfranchised from the mating system gets larger and larger and larger,
Mm.
men will at some point become really misogynistic and say women aren't worth it, and then our species is over.
Well, I don't think it would ever reach that level, but isn't that kind of what we see now with the incel phenomenon? They are acting very hostile and resentful towards women, and they're about sexual selection overall. And they're kind of retreating from participating in that process and living their lives in online worlds. I think that is kind of what we see to some extent. I don't think it would ever threaten the species' existence in any way, because I think we're beyond that at this stage. And also, there's enough top guys from evolution's point of view to do the job.
So do you see it kind of a dystopian future where there's only a small number of men that get to have sex with most women, and most men hold women in contempt?
Where those top status guys hold women in contempt?
No, where they get the women and they're happy, but most men hold women in contempt.
Yeah, I do. That's my bleak vision, dystopian. I talk about the movie, the Joaquin Phoenix movie, Her. Have you seen that one?
Yes, it's one of my favorite movies.
It's a very interesting movie and a kind of a social commentary on where we might be headed. Whereas this guy has fallen in love with a operation information processing system, like a computer, AI. Mm-hmm. And he finds out that's kind of a relationship for him, a parasocial relationship with an artificial intelligence. Could we be headed that way with sex robots? It's conceivable. Men might consider that that's a lot more rewarding to invest their time, effort, and money in than being humiliated on the mating market. And you already see this with the rise of things like OnlyFans, which is inexplicable considered the amount of hardcore pornography that's available for free online. But a lot of men are forking out hundreds of pounds per month to chat with an OnlyFans content creator. That's a new phenomenon.
Yes, there is a men's rights activist who I've interviewed before called Karen Strawn.
Oh, yeah.
Who, when asked about that, said something that was quite surprising. She said those women were actually exploiting men by giving them sort of...
A lot of incels have kind of said that to me too, that they see it as the exploitation running the other way. I tend to think, my line for exploitation would be quite high there. They seem to be getting a service back. They're not being hoodwinked into purchasing something that they didn't think they were getting. It's real or perceived intimacy, probably perceived. For the most part, I think both consumer and content creator know the true nature of the dynamic, and it's to a certain extent pretense. And in other cases, there might be real intimacy between sex worker and client. That's not unusual.
Mm-hmm. So you think romances can blossom from OnlyFans transactions?
Not romances in the same way what we might know of as romance, but certainly intimacy. And if I was an incel, I think that some would be better than none. And I would probably, and also there's a level of freedom in that kind of intimacy rather than having to, with that kind of nature of a dynamic that's so transactional, a man could actually, he can get exactly what he shops around for. Whereas on the actual mating market, he'd have to flex a lot to even get anything, and then it might not even be that good for what he wants.
Do you think part of maybe what's driving the incel phenomenon is there's a romanticization of relationships, and people don't really take seriously what you have to do to make a relationship successful, which is largely kind of negotiate and compromise and not get everything you want?
Yeah, I think that's true. And there's one of my favorite books by an author called Eli Finkel. He wrote a book called The All or Nothing Marriage. And it's just a phenomenal book. I'd encourage any of your listeners to go out and read it. And he describes how marriages have become all or nothing now and very high altitude. And that it's only the top marriages are better than ever, right? But average marriage is suffering because it's demanding so much of you. Your marriage partner now needs to be your sexual partner, help you reach your full potential, be your perfect soulmate personality-wise, find them physically attractive, keep you entertained. It's so exacting that only the top level people can do that for each other. And average marriages are suffering, whereas those at the top of the pinnacle are having better than ever marriages. Weird phenomenon.
Interesting. So people are giving up on marriages unless they're at the top of the line.
Well, it's kind of the marriage, what's expected of marriage is so exacting now that you can only really accomplish it if you're very high, if you don't have a lot of stress coming in from other sides. Does that make sense?
Interesting, yeah.
There's a really good, if you don't get a chance to read the book, he wrote a long read Atlantic article about it, this idea of the all or nothing marriage. Mm-hmm. It's kind of similar to luxury beliefs that we talked about in our first episode.
Mm-hmm. So do you think kind of the elephant in the room, the thing in the background of all of this, is that we're living in a culture where people expect way too much of other people in ways they didn't before?
Certainly, I think romantically, yeah. And, this idea that one person needs to be all things for you, and you have to demand that they help you meet your full potential and everything. It's a tall order to ask of someone.
Yeah. Well, I hope that most people and most self-identified incels can find love in the long run without too many of those high expectations ruining everything for them.
Right. And also to add to that, I hope that too, but to add to that even if they don't view that as they're a failure entirely, that they don't tie their self-worth completely to one metric of success. There's a load of different metrics for it, and you build your own vision of success.
Yes, you don't need a partner to be a successful person.
Yeah, it's not the incels might say, oh, that's easy for you to say, but I don't think you should tie your self-worth to any one metric of success, whether that's academic, professional, romantic, physical, whatever it might be.
Yeah, I totally agree. And on that note, that was a great podcast. Thank you so much for that, William.
That was good, wasn't it? It was good. It was fun.
That was the Culture and the Offensive podcast. This is Greg Scorzo. If you like this podcast, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. And if you're interested in any of the other things that we do at Kodo Publishing, check out www.cultureontheoffensive.com. At Culture and the Offensive, you can purchase my new book, Post-Socratic Dialogues Love, available from amazon.co.uk and amazon.com. You can also hear 3 chapters of that book for free in my play Love Before COVID, which we will post a link to below. So stay safe, be courageous, and don't forget to go outside of your comfort zone. And remember when you hear things, remember